Hi again, welcome to the second day of CIWEM's Central Southern Branch's annual seminar on property flood resilience. I'm Alex Lane, one of the vice chairs of the branch. CIWEM is a Royal Chartered professional body and independent charity whose aim is to work towards a safer, more sustainable world, building a global community of water and environmental professionals dedicated to working for public benefit. This is the second of a three-part annual seminar, each running from 12 noon to 1 p.m, with the final session tomorrow. Yesterday, we spoke about moving from PFR strategy to delivery. Today, we'll consider some customer perspectives on PFR. And tomorrow, we'll be looking at how to overcome PFR delivery challenges. First of all, a few housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CIWEM website. If you experience any technical issues and need assistance, please use the chat feature on Zoom to get our attention. We will take as many questions as we can at the end of the presentations during our panel discussion. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment about the talks, please use the Q&A facility on Zoom. Chat is for technical issues only. We don't provide CPD certificates, but 1 hour CPD is attributable to this webinar. And a quick plug for CIWEM National. CIWEM made a climate and ecological declaration at the end of 2019, and it will be holding events and activities that address the issues arising from the declaration and linking into the two COP meetings taking place in 2021. That's COP26 and COP15. Finally, before we get going with the presentations, I'll first introduce our speakers. First up is Vikki McCausland from the Environment Agency. She is the EA's national lead for property flood resilience, working on improving delivery standards across the sector. Today, she will talk to you about the role of a national procurement framework in mainstreaming PFR. Dr. Bev Adams will then take you through some business perspectives on PFR. She is head of climate and catastrophe resilience at Marsh and the PFR Roundtable Business Adoption Pathway lead and project director. Karen Morley-Chesworth will then provide an eye-opening perspective on PFR as someone with first-hand experience of being flooded and then investing in PFR. Our final presenter is Dr. David Kelly, Head of Climate Resilience Surveys at Marsh, and he will take us through a series of priorities for business adoption of PFR. We'll then follow these brief talks with a panel discussion facilitated by Mary Dhonau. Mary has been flooded herself on many occasions and has extensive experience in supporting and advising the victims of flooding during their recovery. Mary is currently involved in all 3 PFR Pathfinder projects, and she holds an OBE for services to the environment. Okay, with that introduction out of the way, I'll pass you to Vicky for her presentation.
Lovely, thanks very much, Alex, and thank you for inviting me here today. Great opportunity to talk around a framework for delivery. So obviously today we're really thinking about the customer perspective of PFR. So this is really trying to set out how our delivery framework may help in that. So we can just go on to the first slide, please, Alex. Thank you. So we already have at the Environment Agency a procurement framework in place. But one of my main roles right now is to review that to create a new one, which will go live next year. And the main reason for that is that we really need to start looking at people's expectations and providing focus to the end users, so homeowners or business owners. Some of our drivers is around increasing uptake of the use of our frameworks. By doing this, we can enable that we have consistency across the country and really ensure that we get swift delivery after a flood when it's a time that people need to recover. Quality is a huge issue. We need to really focus on this, and we've seen things change in the last few years where we now have the code of practice in regards to PFR to improve standards and delivery throughout the whole process. So not just looking at standards, really looking at around how PFR is delivered in the first place. It provides confidence. The thing that we always need to remember is homeowners and property owners really need to have confidence that the changes that they are making to their properties really are to the highest standard that we can possibly achieve. And it's around facilitation. This is huge as an organisation and for our partners as well, is that we really need to think about how we can provide customers with the tools to build back better and to adapt their properties particularly in light of messages that have gone out today within the press around the need to adapt to climate change. But it's really important to think that PFR isn't just about products. So if we just go on to the next slide, please. So PFR, everyone always says to me, oh, well, it's about resistance. It's about products that prevent or try to reduce the chance of water entering the property. But actually, it's really important to understand that it's bigger than that. PFR itself, you also have to think around recoverability. So how can a property be adapted if water does get into the building? Remembering that a product that you put on a building isn't there to stop water. You can never stop water.
Victoria,
water does get in.
Victoria, sorry to interrupt you, but your sound quality isn't brilliant. Would it be possible for you to turn down the volume of your speaker, because it might be a sound bad?
Okay, I will just try that. 2 seconds. Okay, is that any better?
A little bit better, yes.
Okay, well, apologies for that. Hopefully the slides will give enough information, but obviously if you want any more afterwards, I'm happy to obviously answer any questions where people feel like they've not heard me very well. So in terms of that recoverability, obviously, like I say, it's about recognising that water is likely to get into your property at some point, and what can you do to adapt to make it easier to get back into the house as soon as possible. And preparedness, people really forget about how preparedness and the work we do as organisations is critical to property flood resilience. It's knowing what to do and when. Throughout the whole process of flooding, in a sense, it's how you prepare in the first place to know what to do if the weather is bad, and also what to do after the house is flooded so that you can recover as quickly as possible. To go on to the next slide. Thank you. So in terms of the framework itself, we are looking at coming out next year with a new framework and actually moving to a regional hub approach. And the main reason for this is that we can really facilitate and collaborate better if we're working within smaller areas. This is where I would see our suppliers really being able to work more closely with risk management authorities to understand where PFR could be used as a solution and actually helping to drive programs moving forward. On to the next slide, please. I'll be able to pick up on what our framework is likely to look like. So we'll have 3 lots. So these are basically how we go to procurement to deliver the work. And what's really important moving forward is that there is a very clear distinction between how flood risk is identified as being an issue to the property and how products are actually identified in terms of resistance. And importantly, the new framework will also look at the full picture that I just picked up on. So not just looking at resistant products, but also recoverability and preparedness as well. And we'll also look at how we can bring resource availability in terms of project management to really support risk management authorities moving forward, like I say, as swiftly as possible, particularly if it's in terms of recoverability after a flood. So on to the next slide. This is where standards, I want to really raise today how important the standards are. Like I said at the beginning, it's about making sure homeowners feel that they have the quality required. So what we're seeing change is obviously the code of practice that I mentioned previously. So the new framework will ensure that the appropriate persons are doing our installations. So we're working with Siren at the moment on some training to ensure that people are correctly trained and have the experience to deliver PFR for us. In terms of products, obviously the British standard BS 851188 came out in 2019, and the framework will be a lot more stringent in that only products with that certification will be allowed. We'll also be looking around the auditing and testing process. Again, back to it's not just products. We may have a confidence in the product because they have BS certification, but we also need to make sure that they've been installed correctly in the first place. And really important is ensuring that the customer fully understands the solutions that are being put in place for them so that they are fully trained, know what to do, and are prepared for the future. And it's really important now, I've just picked up that yes, the new framework will be BS 85-1188 only. We will mention an equivalent certification. However, it's really important to note that we actually have the best standard available at the moment. So there are no current equivalent standards. So on to the next slide, if that's okay. Just wanted to pick up on, I know this will be picked up on later today, so very quickly, what does success look like? I think this is back to my comment earlier around PFR isn't about stopping water getting into a property. This case study here of Carolyn Appleby, she's been flooded a number of times and really has adapted her home and understands what the risk of flooding is to her, constantly making sure that her property is as resilient as possible and learning through that process. So I'll put some links on here, which I know will be shared with people, where we've got some amazing videos and obviously the PFR Emag as well, which shows what people are doing to their property. We're doing really good case studies. So I really would encourage people to have a look at those. But yes, just to finish, it was just obvious to say, PFR isn't about stopping flooding getting into a property. It's about helping people adapt to the risk of flooding now and in light of climate change. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Vicky. That was really good. It was breaking up slightly, but I think we all got the key messages. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bev, over to you.
Hi, hopefully you can see and hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. That's great.
Brilliant. Is my camera on? Because I'm on my phone, my laptop, having a
Yep, we
glitch.
can see you too. Yep.
Perfect. Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. Really nice to hear all of the experiences that Vicky and the team are living every day. The reason why we've been invited to present is that we see the business perspective on flooding and flood resilience every day. And so we wanted to share with you some of the stories and the learnings that we've had over the last couple of years. Yesterday, I spoke about the need for a scoring system for property flood resilience. And that was done in conjunction with Flood Re, although we were talking about scoring for both businesses and also homes. Part of our commitment to wanting to drive that has been because we've seen where the absence of any kind of accountability for resilience is leaving insurers, where it's leaving businesses, where it's leaving banks and lenders. Nobody can really get their arms around the difference that it makes in a structured and systematic manner. So what we thought we'd do is we'd share with you some of the stories that we've been working on over the last few years to help you see how, ahead of scoring becoming live, we can start acting now and making sure that everybody understands the good work that can be done. Granted, you won't be required to do it until scoring and certificates come, but actually there's many really important reasons why people are having to do it anyway, and I'll come on to those. So if you could move forward on the slide, thank you. Just so you know what we're doing every day, we have a very structured approach to how we work through flooding. And in my world, I am typically working with businesses large and small. Sometimes it's just one location. Sometimes it can be thousands of locations. And as I'll come on to, one of the reasons why we often get called in to help is because an insurer will have a concern that some of those locations have flood risk. We also get called in because they've had a flood claim or a loss. Anyway, whichever the reason, what we would typically become quickly caught in needing to do is to understand why it's at risk, i.e. do the modelling and map out what the models are telling us is the source of the flooding. We'll then need to support them with a survey, which would be a property flood resilience survey, and that's what my colleague Dr. David Kelly leads. Once we know what is at risk, why it's at risk, then we help people make changes. And that's not just changes to the buildings, it's very much linked into the people part too. And Mary, you're going to want me to mention the importance of recoverability as part of that. We're certainly not advocates of people who just believe in can commute alone, holding back the water. Very much, if you flood Friday, how are you back up and running Saturday? Absolutely critical for businesses. And then, of course, working for Marsh, insurance is very often at the heart of this. I also work with a lot of banks and lenders. So for them, again, knowledge that organisation can get insurance is a major driver. I'll come on to the more stories in a second. And then monitoring. We all know that this only works well if people have a proactive foot, on the front foot with how to keep track of whether there's a flood event pending. And then one thing I just wanted to mention to everyone today is that climate lens. Sometimes people are thinking, why act? Well, increasingly, businesses are having to act because flooding falls under climate, which falls under mandatory TCFD reporting. If you haven't heard of it, it's the new thing that all businesses have to do. And climate also falls under ESG, which is the not mandatory, but it's the thing that is going to become part of the DNA of every business. People will sit in judgment on a business for its ESG credentials, and flooding and climate is the E, essentially, a major part of it. So this is what I work through every day with lots of our different clients. But what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about some of the specific cases that we've seen. And then in a few minutes, David Kelly will make that come to life with what we see as the priorities for the industry. So if you could move on to the next slide. So some of the language that we use to help people understand why they should act: design resilience, build resilience, invest resilience, maintain your property in a resilient manner, and most importantly, recover resilience. And these are punchy words, but when you're talking to the CFO of a business, the CEO of a business, sometimes they have to persuade people to put money aside to do this work. Sometimes they're not keen on CapEx. And so you've got to help them understand what the benefit is for them. So I'm going to walk quickly through why each of these different situations on the left had to do some work on flood resilience. So the first one, it's a very large horse racing course in the UK. They had had 3 major floods. The first 2 times they flooded, they recovered, but they didn't recover in a resilient manner. And so they flooded again, and then they were out for another 6 months. And then they flooded again, and they were out for another 6 months. Now, obviously, that's counter to the whole mission of us as flood resilience professionals. So what was the changing factor? This time, the third time round, we were involved in how they then scoped the restoration. And we made sure it was done in line with the Code of Practice. And so we went out, did the survey, David Kelly led it, and we provided for about 25 different assets across the site, the right kind of resilience approach. And it was a really complicated project, but because they knew that it was going to be future-proofing them, and this idea of Flood Friday, be back up and running Saturday, was what they wanted to achieve, they have, as part of that recovery, put money aside to do this work. So really important, really, for them, business changing. The second one, this is a really interesting situation because there's a leisure centre that was designed according to a 1 in 100 year return period for flood, but it wasn't done in full consultation with the insurers. And so when the designs were approved and work started, the organisation then goes back to their insurers for their renewal. And the insurer says, well, we're not comfortable with a 1 in 100 year return period design specification. We need it to be a 1 in 250. And this to me is why we need to be having a very joined up approach that links businesses with insurers with PFR so that everybody understands and adheres to a similar kind of standard. And that's what we hope to achieve with scoring and certification. The third one, I've got lots of these. We do a lot of work for asset investment firms who own historic buildings. They own assets around the UK and Europe. And it's a constant decision for them. Do we keep it? Do we divest it? And people are increasingly looking at these properties in terms of what's their flood risk today? What's their flood risk under a climate scenario? And they're making really important decisions based on this. And so we would go in and we would go and do an assessment, and then it may then guide their decision making of what to keep versus what to lose. Also, we call it due diligence. When they're deciding where to invest, they often want to have a PFR assessment underpinning that too, which would mean going to site and doing a survey. So really major driver for businesses who may be thinking about what to do in future. Next one, historic landed estates. This is one which is really interesting to me because they have a long-term curatorship to think about. And so they've had a building that's been standing for 900 years, it still floods. What they can do is limited because of its status. And so the PFR is very much weaving into many of those businesses and how they think creatively about avoiding floods in the future. And was talking to some of the big palaces actually yesterday about this exact subject. And what they want is to train all of their in-house engineers to be able to do this. And that's part of our mission, I think, both at Marsh and as an industry to provide that training. Moving swiftly on, a haulage firm. This is a really interesting reason why PFR was needed. In this situation, the warehouse flooded. The warehouse is tenanted by the haulage firm, a major one. You'll see them on the motorways all the time. Rightly so, they're very worried about storing things in this particular warehouse. Now, the owner reinstated the warehouse. They put it back, they washed it down, they hosed it down. But the haulage firm are not happy to reoccupy because they say that all their clients aren't comfortable with them storing stuff there. So we've caught in quite an interesting situation where PFR is the only solution that's going to get the landlord and the haulage firm and all the haulage firm's clients happy. The question there is who pays, and this one is actually work in progress. Last one from me, a bakery. This is one of these key things where water can't be allowed in. Major site, flooded. It's actually a production facility out for 9 months. PFR is the only way they can go forward, but they need to do it with an eye on actually holding back the water rather than recoverability. So these are all things that the business adoption pathway of the roundtable are working through how we handle. And I just wanted to give some colour on that before I hand back over. Thank you.
Thanks, Bev. That was really useful, really interesting to get those different insights. And a really useful and interesting insight coming up next. Karen, it's you. Over to you.
Hi, thank you. Right, this slide really shows how flood resilience does work, because this is the new Floodgate that we have we bought after Storm Desmond. But we wanted to make sure that the house was resilient, and it's a good job we did, really, because we didn't expect the gate to stop the water forever. It did come in on that flood, which was in February 2020. But when it did come in, there wasn't carpet, there wasn't wooden floors anymore. Everything was solid. We had a nice solid floor, everything's tiled, and we were able to remove the door when the flood had gone and brush out all the water. So that it's a hopeful view, I think, is that you can see the flood water coming, you know what's going to happen, but you've got that little bit of extra time to prepare, and also you know that you can clear up afterwards. Could you have the next slide, please? We always wanted to do things better, and we're always looking for the next time we flood. But that perspective that we have, that we live in an area, as you can see, where opposite our house is the White House there, and we are right next to the river. It's called the Sands. It's called Sands because it's often flooded and leaves sand there. We know it's going to happen again. We've got to be prepared and be realistic about it. But the problem is we've got the information and advice, but the tradespeople that we've actually been working with and utilities didn't seem to be on the same page as us, which made it quite difficult sometimes when you're asking for the plugs to be made higher when they were put in after Storm Desmond, and you come back and the electricians put them a little bit lower. When you're actually arguing with your builder that, yes, I do want this to be a solid floor, I do want it to be sealed, this is the best for us because it's going to happen again. And they say, oh, you shouldn't think like that. But actually, you do have to think like that. So maybe some of the education should be maybe around tradespeople, small builders, firms, but also the utilities as well. Could you have the next slide, please? We had an ongoing problem really with the electricity meter, which is in a cupboard, and that's the floor level. And it comes up about 2 meters, so it's well covered is the actual meter. But there seems to be a problem between the supplier and the actually energy network. And I've tried for 6 years to have that moved up. We did pay for the fuse box to be moved up, but this has to be done by utilities. So I think there's a lot of work to be done with those organisations, because without the support and backing of the utilities, it's going to be impossible to make our home truly resilient, which is a shame, really, because there's a really good opportunity to actually improve things for people in our area, because we couldn't get our electricity back on. It knocked out quite a few of the homes in the town as well. So I think that's something that I'm really quite passionate about, is getting that message across. We all have to work together, but it does mean getting the utilities involved and builders of all levels as well. If you could go to the next slide, please. We had to have, after Storm Desmond, all the plaster taken off the walls and had it sealed. But this was where we had the problem with the builders, that they didn't want to seal it because they felt that it would make us into a bowl that would hold the water, which in fact it does, but it means when we brush it out, we just wash the walls down. So the solid floor and the tanked walls for us really did make a difference. And I'd like to sort of like share that, so that we could share that with people who've got to prove it to other builders around the country. It really does work, and it really did after the next flood. Could I have the next slide, please? Because it is the small changes that's made a big difference to us. At the time, Floodry obviously came in after Storm Desmond. And as you can see there, we did have a wooden floor in the dining room, which was laid on concrete. So we did claim for a wooden floor, but we invested a little bit more money and we tiled the floor. We did get a grant from local council grant to make the other room a solid floor as well. And it really, the urge is to try and get back into the house as quickly as possible. So the urge is to go along with what your builder says. The urge is to just replace what you had with like for like. And that, at the time, that was the sort of like message we were getting from the insurance company as well. But we did take a step back. We did do things differently, and we did take that independent advice, and we did create a home that's a nice home. You can't tell it's flood resilient. It just looks like it's a sort of like a style choice. So it doesn't have to look clunky. It doesn't have to look ugly, but it does make a difference. If we can go to the next slide, please. This was the February 2020 flood. And I think when you're looking from the outside in, it's difficult to understand how much pressure is put on you at the time to actually take the right steps and do the right things and try and make things better. We did do quite a lot of what we wanted to do, but in retrospect, we now have a list of things that we will do differently the next time. And one of those things is making sure that we do get a waterproof kitchen. We were persuaded by the builder, no, don't do that. We can just replace this one. And I don't really want to go through that again. And also things like the doors. I wanted wood doors that you could lift off. And they said, oh, no, you don't need those. But when we did for this time, water did get in the bottom of the door. We did clean them off, and they've survived a small flood, but I don't think there will a big one next time. But looking at what happened after this flood, it slowed the flow of water into the house. It meant we could lift all the furniture up. It meant that none of the furniture got damaged, none of the electrics got damaged, nothing got damaged. All we had to do was brush the water out, disinfect the house, and we were back in our property in 24 hours. So it makes me feel better that I know that we did the right things, but I think we can do it even better next time. I think the fact that we've got some new standards and there's going to be more advice, impartial advice, I think that's going to make such a difference to so many to so many people who live in a situation like us, where you do live with flood and you have to accept that that's going to happen, and you're just looking for any improvements that can make it easier for you to bounce back. Any questions, I'll take those at the end, if that's okay.
Thank you, Karen. That's great. Really helps to bring it to life with the pictures and your description. I'm sure it will prompt some discussion. We'll come to that in the panel session in a few minutes. Before we do, David, over to you for the final presentation.
Thanks, Alex, and good afternoon, everybody. Hope you can all hear me okay. Just to congratulate Karen, really, initially, I think, on her presentation, but also on taking a bold approach to protecting her own property. I think it's always a challenge, particularly within the construction industry and the built environment, to embrace new concepts, to embrace innovation, to deviate from the norm, and to look at ways in which you can improve the situation and performance of a property. And unfortunately, too often there's pushback from construction professionals, from planners, from other regulatory perspectives in terms of what you can and cannot do, and that can act as somewhat of a barrier to the adoption of some of the new ways of building back better. We need to embrace if PFR is to become part of fully integrated into the built environment and to deliver the benefits that we all hope that it can. I think also, just to reflect on what's been said already, we've talked already quite a bit about resilience, and assuming that by adopting and integrating PFR, we are making the situation better. But we quickly need to get to a point where we can collectively recognise the value of PFR, not just as from the property owner's perspective, but also from the wider community and professional community's perspective. That recognition, that value is really important in terms of making sure we develop solutions that can protect properties into the future. If you could just move on to my slide, Alex, please. So what I really just wanted to touch upon today was a number of priorities, and as Bev has already mentioned, at Marsh, we are leading the business adoption pathway work on behalf of the Roundtable, and I just wanted to share some perspectives and priorities that we have seen emerging via the work that Bev's already highlighted today, and that work spans across both the private and public sectors, but particularly in relation to the adoption of PFR and some of the challenges that are being faced by businesses. So in relation to the first point that I've highlighted here, there remains a challenge, as I've mentioned, in recognising and measuring the effectiveness of PFR, and that, I suppose, was one of the main drivers behind the development of the Code of Practice, and then more recently the Resilience Scoring Project, which I know you heard something about yesterday. And the fact that PFR hasn't been recognised and measured consistently or effectively acts as a barrier to businesses in terms of them voluntarily investing in PFR. We've spoken to businesses who have looked at grant funding and have been put off by the amount of funding available, and often the laborious processes involved in applying for it. And that's a direct quote from some of the businesses, not my own perspective. So if we are looking to businesses to adopt PFR, we need to make sure that it's an attractive proposition for them, and we need to make sure that it provides value to them, both in terms of the protection and recoverability that it provides, but also in the ease of which they can go through the process. Businesses who are investing in PFR do it often because their insurer has requested it or requires it as part of our Build Back Better approach. But there also remains a question of how much more resilient a business is after it has adopted PFR. We've seen over the years a lack of consistency in the application of PFR. That will be helped by the Code of Practice, but also a lack of recognition of the benefit, and hopefully that will be assisted by the Resilience Scoring Project. These are challenges for businesses, and it's difficult for businesses to invest in something where they can't see a tangible and immediate benefit from. So that should be a priority, and some of the current activities that we're undertaking collectively should help to address this. My second point refers to some tensions that we've seen between the landlord and tenant agreements. Landlords, both across the domestic and non-domestic sector, are likely to be well aware of the flood risk to their assets, will perhaps have even a deeper understanding from their own experiences of flood events of the past. Their own insurers may reflect these risks and the measures the landlords have taken to address these. But we've seen some inconsistency, particularly in the non-domestic sector, and how the landlord passes some of this information on to its tenants. So if a landlord has taken measures to provide greater levels of resilience and recoverability across its estate, how much of this information has been passed on to the tenant and how integrated is that becoming into the tenant's operation? There's a real question mark around the consistency of that approach. That can also be true across the domestic sector. And the question has to be raised, is the tenant consistently aware of the PFR measures taken by the landlord? And are they reflecting this in their own fit out and their own operation in terms of how they operate within the property, in terms of how they illustrate their business, their operations, and how they go about their day-to-day activity? Are there any requirements from the landlord to inform the tenant of the responsibility? And are there any insurance requirements to this effect? So these are questions that remain largely unanswered. And we've seen that Bev has already given examples of some of our more recent survey work. And we did a project for a large logistics hub in the Midlands, where the tenant was a very large organisation which had suffered quite significant surface water flooding in the past. And we identified that the main source of that was a lack of surface water drainage and also lack of maintenance within a culvert, which was actually just outside the perimeter of the site. And the management of that culvert fell within the requirements and responsibilities of the landlord. But there had been no dialogue between the tenant and the landlord in terms of how that was managed, how often it was cleaned and how it was performing. But the fact that was going on was having a direct impact upon the tenant, putting their business at risk and their asset at risk. So there needs to be greater understanding of that landlord and tenant discussion and the sharing of information. My third point supports this challenge and asks if there are examples of good practice within this landlord and tenant integration. Could potentially tenancy agreements provide a legal mechanism to ensure that both the landlord and the tenant recognise their individual responsibilities and collectively benefit from a more integrated approach? Could we perhaps identify good practice examples and how this could be developed? And should this be a priority? Should we seek greater integration between landlord and tenants to make sure that the benefits of PFR can be recognised and integrated across that relationship? The fourth point suggests the recognition and value of PFR could be referenced in planning applications. Flood risk to a business and its assets can be identified through the planning process, but could this be used as a further means of ensuring PFR is integrated into the regulatory process? Obviously, recognising that planners may have limited resources. However, this could be a means of further recognising and valuing PFR and supporting its wider adoption. So coming to my last point, and perhaps just reflected on some of the things I've said over the last few minutes, how can we drive knowledge and uptake of PFR? Most of our recent interactions with businesses have reinforced the need for more consistent and effective support for PFR adoption, perhaps recognised within regulatory frameworks, valued by insurers and businesses alike. Businesses also need direction to see the value in PFR, either via the availability of support and information that can be consistently applied. We should seek examples of good practice in landlord and tenant agreements and support their adoption more widely, clearly articulating the benefits and perhaps bringing into that a view from the insurer. How does the insurer view that landlord-tenant relationship, and can they reflect that greater integration within the cover that they provide? But it's fair to say, with the risks to the business continuity from climate change and flooding are becoming increasingly pronounced, and we all recognise that, we understand that. But we as the PFR community should provide valuable support to businesses so they can adequately address the challenges, and we can do that using our collective expertise and experiences, and hopefully we can share some of that as we go through the rest of this event. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. And thank you to all the presenters. I thought you gave really good overviews of your respective subjects, and that will prompt some discussion, I'm sure. So we have about 15 minutes now for a discussion. I'll pass over to Mary to facilitate that. Just a flag that you can put any questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. You can vote for questions you like, and we'll try and include some of those in the discussion. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you. If all presenters could put their cameras on, that would be great. That was an excellent panel of presentations. And I just want to have a period of reflection that this month marks 21 years exactly since my worst flood, when I was waist deep in sewage flood water in my home. And actually, because that was my worst flood, like Karen, I didn't want to go through it again. So I made my home flood resilient in a very simple way. I used a concrete type plaster on the walls and stone floors, very similar to Karen. Put the plug sockets up the wall and put varnish, yacht varnish on my skirting boards. And when I was flooded again in 2007, I was able to wash out, sanitize and move back downstairs in a matter of days. Not quite so quickly as Karen, but in a matter of days. And since then, I have been banging the drum for PFR. That's 21 long years that I've been promoting PFR. And I've been on that PFR journey for all that time. And this series of seminars is making me incredibly happy. Whilst we haven't completed that journey, the journey is moving so fast in the right direction. We've got to thank the DEFRA Property Flood Resilience Roundtable and the Bondfield Report, and people like Karen who are willing to share her powerful story with us. But I'm going to be a bit selfish and say that start with the first question really to the panel. Karen has highlighted some problems. One of the utility meters, one of the problems with her builders. How do we as professionals in the industry change the mindset and work with those to actually get them onto the same page that we're on, to enable us to be ready to mainstream PFR in 2025? So it's over to you guys. Well, thank you, David.
Hi, Mary. And yeah, first of all, congratulations for your longevity and sticking with it for 21 years. I think we can all take great benefit from your expertise, and it's great to have you still fully engaged with the discussion. So thanks for that. I think I can perhaps answer from a construction perspective. I've got some experience in that sector over a number of years, and that was really my first introduction into PFR. And the construction industry is very conservative with a small c in terms of how it embraces change, and evolution as opposed to revolution is a mantra that you'll hear quite consistently within the construction sector. So the reluctance to deviate from the norm, the reluctance to embrace new materials or new technologies is difficult. However, there is a solution within the regulatory frameworks that can accelerate that change. Now we have support, collectively we have support within the devolved governments around the UK in relation to this topic, and there needs to be greater reference to PFR within building regulations and standards to make sure that default position from building professionals of no, it can't be done, or we don't do it like that, can be challenged and we can move past it. So there needs to be greater recognition within that regulatory framework to allow these things to happen from a legal perspective. And if we can get that in place, then hopefully we'll see the greater adoption of some of these more innovative approaches. Thanks.
Bev or Vicky, have you got any further comments on that one?
Yeah, I think Mary, just to kind of add to that, I think you're right, and I think someone else have also asked a question around building regulations and planning, particularly for new buildings. I think another thing that we also need to be mindful of is if you want work done on your boiler or you're changing your windows and your doors, people can go online and can get a register of the kind of appropriate people who do that work. So a lot of work's happening across the industry now to think about, well, how can we do that for PFR? Is there a way that homeowners can go straight on the internet and say, I need a tradesperson that I have confidence in? So yes, things are afoot and we are starting to have a look at it, but I think that would really help people. And obviously as organisations, we have access to people. But again, it's giving that that toolkit to the homeowners. So something like that I think would really help as well.
I think Bev, as a PFR round table, it's something that we could certainly take forward and start banging the drum of, isn't it?
Yeah, I see it where we get through that sort of step 3 of the model that I showed, and we are at an implementation stage. And certainly in my role, we are not allowed to make a recommendation, but we are allowed to point people to reliable providers of services. And therefore, I massively agree, Vicky, that that's something we could do that would really, really help people. And I think one of the things that insurers at the moment, there's many things that I think need to be sort of put in place for this all to be completely sorted. But I think the actual discipline that is instilled through the code, where the work is done, it's then checked and verified, and it's of a certain standard, is a key part of it. And one of the blips that we've had is insurers trusting that it's actually going to work in practice, not just in theory. I haven't got the golden bullet to answer that one. I think it's something where work like your compilations, Mary, that you've been producing that show and evidence that they're at the kind of the forefront of all of it. But I think pulling together things like access to credible people, disciplined checking process, and making sure that insurers are involved every step of the way have to be part of that.
Absolutely. Karen, just for peace of mind for you at the moment, I know it's going to be some expenditure, but you can get a bit like a door barrier. You can get one for your meters and your utilities. And if you want to talk offline, I can point them in the right direction for companies that do it. Just a quick reference to my Emag that Bev mentioned. It's on my website. There's 40 very inspirational case studies, including Karen's, marydhonau.com, if you want to have a look at it. Jed, have we got any more questions? Because I could keep going with questions all day.
Yes, there's the top of the list. We've got one about the planning process and whether you ever see PFR becoming a mandatory condition of planning. Again,
David and Vicky, over to you two.
I'm going to jump in here, if that's all right. And obviously, I'm responsible to this in terms of, I guess, the role of the Environment Agency in our kind of unit, is that I can completely see the need to really think about resilience in new buildings. But I think one of the things that we need to be really mindful of is that the first point of call is making sure that housing is getting built in the right place and that we're not continuing to build in floodplains and areas of high risk. So the fact that we have standards and products and things in place isn't a get out clause. We shouldn't be seeing buildings built in appropriate locations. So that's something to be really mindful of. And I know obviously having a look at building regulations is very difficult. So I'm not going to lie, to get a building regulation change. And then when I first started with you, Mary, you're like, yeah, I've got to look at that one. But it is something that honestly we'll continue to advise on and really have a look at how it can happen. I know there's some great cases across the country where PFR has been used on new builds. But like I say, certainly the Environment Agency, there's a statutory consult team, and just have to really be mindful that we need to build in the right places in the first place.
David?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. And yeah, I absolutely appreciate, it is a real challenge to, to make these changes. I mean, I think that the other route that we could consider, I mean, there is a lot of emphasis around energy and carbon and there has been over a long time in relation to climate change. So we're working within the same sphere of risks, and what we don't do very well is to seek opportunities to look at PFR when there are other works being deployed within properties. So whether it be underfloor insulation, whether it be cavity wall insulation, loft insulation, replacement boiler schemes, whatever, when there are works that are going on within properties as part of a wider climate related issue, then surely we can start to look at opportunities where we can embed PFR into that process and perhaps have a double hit in terms of the benefit to the property itself.
Yeah, so things like closed cell insulation, for instance, has become mandatory. Be lovely, wouldn't it? Hey. Any more? Oh, yeah, sorry, Bev, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, no worries. I think an interesting comment is that I've been speaking with a lot of businesses who are on this ESG reporting journey, and because climate and flooding are a major part of the E in environmental, social and governance, it's really fascinating how you talk to a business who are in the construction business, they'll tell you a story like one that I spoke to, which is of all of the new builds, when it comes to 2025, 25% of them will be carbon net zero. Right, so because of ESG reporting, they're now making a lot of changes to how they do their designs to be carbon net zero. But when do we get to a point where, because of property flood resilience, the buildings are designed in a manner which is flood resilient? And this is where we're trying to turn the dial up and say that there's credit beyond being carbon net zero as part of environmental, social and governance reporting. And it's one of these things that is kind of taking a bit of time. Everyone started doing carbon first. They're now moving into physical and transition risk, as we call it. And with physical risk, because flooding is the major driver in the UK, we have a real opportunity not just to go, there is risk on these kind of assets, there are risks in these locations, but actually this is what you do to counter it, i.e. become resilient. And that's one thing that I don't know that the government is necessarily pushing to a great enough degree, where it's pulled up into the agenda and it's pulled up into literally what happens in the news every day. We should be having big adverts around how things like PFR can help support your climate journey, not just about going net zero. Sorry to be sounding like I'm preaching a little bit, but it's so interesting how carbon, no flood, and yet it should be.
And actually, we're going to talk with Karen mentioned her kitchen. When you flood, your kitchen is torn out, thrown away. That is not very environmentally friendly. So if you install a flood resilient kitchen, and there's some beautiful ones on the market, I often suffer from kitchen envy when I go around talking to people, that actually, if you get flooded and you can wash and sanitize your kitchen and use it again, that is working towards carbon neutral as well. Jed, we can't carry on talking about this, it's selfish. Can you give me another question, please?
Yeah, sure, Mary. The next one we got on the list is around the disparity that we're seeing between insurance and the Environment Agency's requirements for different return periods, and is there a way to get these to align with each other?
Right, okay, Vicky, are you going to?
Yeah, I can come in here, because actually this is a really timely question, in that I literally set up a meeting this morning with Floodgate to talk around this very thing. I think one of the things to really be mindful of is that when a PFR scheme is put in place, you get a report at the end of that process. So there's currently a template on .uk, and it is something that the homeowner can then use and they can give to their insurance company so that they will hopefully see a benefit within their insurance premiums. But you're right, the way that the Environment Agency will write about the risk and the way that the insurance company do it is very, very different. So I think we've got to have this session to kind of say, okay, what is it that the insurance industry need? What is it that we're currently doing, and how can we start marrying those up so that people see the benefit? We've talked so much today that it's all right as saying to people in our jobs, do PFR, do PFR. I'm from Yorkshire. If I want to do something in my house, I want to see the financial benefit. And that is where we've got to get to. People have got to see it as a benefit to themselves. So very timely, and those discussions are happening at the moment.
Bev, have you got any comments on this? Because I know it's something you're quite passionate about.
So it's fully recognised, number one, that this is something which has been a problem for ages. And I'm not sure I've got an immediate answer other than we're working with the NAFRA 2 team just to make sure that everybody's got a really clear view on the major differences and why they're there. I think that as we move into things like flood performance certificates, it's really critical. And there's nothing to say that you only consult one data source in terms of how you assess your risk. If we can't align, then maybe we report on both and we actually come up with an approach of dealing with that. Because you're absolutely right, the insurers trust their view, but there's sort of several different ways that they could be looking at it because there are many different models out there. And so I think, number one, that needs to be considered as part of the certificates that get developed. And then number two, when we then look at resilience and how you might score resilience, the project that David Kelly is leading on this, we've got a whole work package to try and think through how we work with independent risk assessments, which is what's coming from the Environment Agency maps or the JBA maps or the ambiental maps. It's the risk part. And then how do we add on top of that the layer of resilient measures? So, you know, the risk gives you the sort of truth of what could happen, and the resilience is almost the counter to that. And how do we bolt all of that together? So, Vicky, just so you know, there's a lot of that thinking going on too, just as we begin this scoring project. And I think it's really, really important that we try and bring that together to a certificate that reflects what's practical, because we're not suddenly going to be able to lay down the law and say you can't use a particular type of flood score, it's free market. People can. So therefore, I think that's got to be recognised and worked around rather than doing something impossible, which is getting everybody to galvanise on one answer, which I don't see happening anytime soon. Insurers take pride in having the insurer view as well. And so we've got to work around that too. But ultimately, Mary, we have to get comfortable that there is a risk level, and it's all about how we massively reduce it through the resilience scoring and actions that really counts here. Just one final point, which I think is really important. We've also had debate around how those same risk maps are adapted according to local measures that are put in place, and also new works, because they get refreshed quite infrequently. And yet, if you as a community know that something has been installed, or you as a homeowner have done PFR work, is there some way to feed that through to the mapping in future? So at lookup points, it's automatically there in black and white in front of you. Again, not something we've solved, but just know that we're fully well aware of it. And the likes of JBA are very open to how they might in future have more of a channel in to adapt their maps. Okay.
I've just seen the time, it's 1 o'clock and we can't take any more questions, sadly. Is that correct? Jed, are you happy with me wrapping up, or Alex?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you, Mary. And yes, we've got to call it to a halt there. I'm sure we could have gone for ages. Thank you for facilitating that. And thank you to all the presenters for their talks. I thought it was a really thought-provoking session. I know we haven't got through to all questions, but I'd encourage everyone to join our final session tomorrow at 12 noon. We'll be focusing more on how we can overcome some of the challenges around PFR that have been raised yesterday and today. So that's it for today's session, but hopefully see some of you tomorrow. Thank you.